From arguably the most famous, volatile, and culturally impactful maximum security prison in Hawaii history, to a prison that houses a highly secretive and heavily restrictive solitary confinement block. Today, we dive inside the top 10 most dangerous prisons in Hawaii and take a look at their dangerous residents. Case 1. Haley Dandurand, December 7, 2017. First Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu, Oahu Sentenced Facility, Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua, Oahu. There is a particular kind of morning that exists only on Oahu's North Shore. The light comes in low and gold across the water. Surfers are already out before most of the island wakes up. Tourists rent modest plantation-style homes tucked along quiet residential streets, expecting nothing more eventful than a week of sunburn and shave ice. It is a place built almost entirely on the assumption of safety. That assumption held for decades in the town of Pupukea, until the 7th of December 2017 when it didn't. To understand what happened that day, you have to understand who Thelma Boinville was before it. She was 51 years old, and to hundreds of children who passed through Sunset Elementary School, she was simply Miss S. Boinville, a substitute teacher known for her warmth, her patience, and the kind of steady presence that makes a classroom feel safe, even when the regular teacher is out. Teaching in Hawaii, as in much of the country, does not pay enough on its own to comfortably support a family. So, like countless working parents across the islands, Boinville took on a second job. She cleaned vacation rental properties, the kind of short-term homes that dot the North Shore, rented out to visitors chasing the same waves that made the area famous. It was steady, unglamorous work. It was the furthest thing from dangerous, until it wasn't. That morning, Boinville brought her 8-year-old daughter along with her. This too was unremarkable, a working mother making do, keeping her child close during a school break, turning a chore into an errand they could do together. What she could not have known was that the vacation rental she had been hired to clean was, at that very moment, being burglarized. Inside the home were two young people whose relationship had begun only a few months earlier and had already, according to later court testimony, curdled into something abusive. Stephen Brown was 23. Haley Dandurand was 20. A recent transplant to the islands from Oregon, where she had grown up before relocating to Oahu to pursue a degree in liberal arts at a local community college. The two had met in August of that year. By the time December arrived, Dandurand would later claim she had endured months of escalating abuse at Brown's hands, an account that would become central to her legal defense, though not one that spared her from the consequences of what happened next. When Boinville let herself into the property to begin her cleaning routine, she walked directly into the middle of an active burglary. What followed was a sustained and brutal physical assault. Investigators who processed the scene recovered a baseball bat, which they determined had been used to inflict the injuries that caused Boinville's death. It is worth pausing here, not to dwell on the mechanics of violence, but to acknowledge what those investigating officers carried with them afterward. Crime scene technicians, first responders, and homicide detectives do not simply document these moments and move on. They carry them. And in a small community like the North Shore, where everybody seems to know somebody who knew the victim, that weight spreads outward in ways that outlast any single investigation. Boinville's 8-year-old daughter was inside the house throughout the attack. In the chaos that followed, Brown and Dandurand made the decision to restrain the child rather than let her go, binding her with duct tape and leaving her in an upstairs bedroom. It is difficult to overstate how differently this story could have ended. The girl survived, physically unharmed by the assault itself, discovered later still tied up but alive, a fact that both investigators and prosecutors would describe, in the years that followed, as one of the only measures of mercy in an otherwise merciless crime. With Boinville no longer able to stop them, Brown and Dandurand looted the home, took her personal belongings, seized her credit and debit cards, and fled the property in her own truck. It was a decision that would prove to be their undoing. A vacation rental is, almost by design, a place where people come and go, and later that afternoon, when the actual renters arrived for their scheduled check-in, they discovered the scene and immediately called police. Word moves fast in small communities, and it moved even faster once Boinville's stolen truck was spotted by an alert member of the public. That tip gave Honolulu Police Department detectives the lead they needed. Within hours, both Brown and Dandurand were located and arrested at a nearby commercial center, bringing a swift end to what could have become a much longer manhunt. What followed the arrests, however, was anything but swift. The wheels of the justice system in Hawaii, as in most places, turn slowly, and this case would take nearly 6 years to reach its conclusion. Brown and Dunderund were charged separately with second-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and a handful of related offenses, and prosecutors made the decision to try them individually rather than together, a strategy that allowed each defendant's specific role and testimony to be scrutinized on its own terms. Brown's trial came first, beginning in January of 2023, more than 5 years after the crime itself. In a move that defense attorneys rarely recommend for a murder defendant, Brown chose to take the stand in his own defense. He told the jury that he had not been the one to kill Boinville, suggesting instead that Dunderund had carried out the fatal assault during a window of time when he had stepped outside the home to act as a lookout. It was a defense that required the jury to believe that Brown, by his own account physically capable of overpowering an adult woman, had simply not been present for the most violent moments of the crime he was accused of. The jury did not find that account persuasive. After less than 4 hours of deliberation, they returned a guilty verdict on all counts: murder, 2 counts of kidnapping, and burglary. Brown showed little visible reaction as the verdict was read. His bail, which had allowed him to remain free throughout years of pre-trial proceedings, was immediately revoked. Dunderund's trial followed later that same year. Her legal team built their defense around the claim of coercive control, arguing that months of documented abuse at Brown's hands had left her unable to meaningfully resist participating in what happened, and that she herself had not been the one to inflict the fatal injuries. It was, in some respects, the mirror image of Brown's defense, each side pointing toward the other as the true source of lethal violence. Prosecutors, for their part, argued that whatever the dynamics of the relationship had been, Dunderund's own actions that day went well beyond passive compliance. They pointed to her active role in restraining the 8-year-old child, her use of the victim's stolen financial cards in the aftermath, and evidence suggesting she had taken steps to help conceal what had happened. After a full day of deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of murder, kidnapping, and burglary, along with additional charges related to the possession of the victim's confidential personal information. Sentencing for both defendants was handed down together on the 6th of December, 2023, 1 day short of the 6th anniversary of Thelma Boinville's death. First Circuit Court Judge Rowena Somerville did not soften her language. She described the case, on the record, as one of the most heinous crimes in recent Hawaiian history, a designation that carried real weight in a state whose violent crime rate remains among the lowest in the nation. Both Brown and Dunderund received life sentences with the possibility of parole for the murder conviction. Dunderund received an additional life sentence with parole eligibility for the kidnapping of the child, along with a 20-year extended term for burglary. All 3 sentences ordered to run consecutively, one after another, rather than simultaneously. Brown's sentence mirrored that structure closely: life for murder, 20 years for kidnapping, and 20 more for burglary, also consecutive. For the friends and family who packed the courtroom gallery that day, the sentencing brought a complicated mix of relief and lingering frustration. Many voiced their belief, both in and outside the courtroom, that neither defendant should ever be eligible for parole, regardless of the legal structure Hawaii law allowed. What no one in that courtroom disputed, however, was the scale of what had been taken. Not just a life, but a teacher who had shaped hundreds of young students, a wife, and a mother whose 8-year-old daughter now carries the memory of that day for the rest of her life. Domestic violence, both as an underlying dynamic in this case and as a broader public health issue, remains a significant concern across Hawaii and the country. If this case, or the abuse allegations woven through it, resonates with your own experience or that of someone you know, the National Domestic Violence Hotline and local Hawaii-based victim witness assistance programs are available around the clock to provide support and resources. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 2, Patricia Wong, June 30, 2009. Hilo Circuit Court, County of Hawaii, Hawaii Island Sentence Facility, Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua, Oahu. Some cases resolve within weeks of a crime taking place. Others take years. And then there are cases like this one. Cases where the truth sits buried for so long that an entire childhood could pass in the time it takes for justice to arrive. for Casey Smith's family that wait lasted nearly 15 years. To understand what was lost, you first have to understand who Casey Smith was. In the tight-knit rodeo circuits of the Big Island, she had already made a name for herself by her early 20s. A standout horsewoman who had competed for Kamehameha School's Kapalama, known to friends simply as Bug. Those who knew her describe a young woman full of energy, generous with her time, and deeply rooted in her community in the rural Puna district. She was 21 years old, living alone in a rented home in the Orchidland Estates subdivision, the kind of quiet, semi-rural neighborhood common across Hawaii Island, where lots stretch out along forested roads and neighbors know each other by name. On the 30th of June, 2009, that life came to an end. Smith was found inside her home with a single gunshot wound to her head. The scene, investigators would eventually determine, had been carefully staged to suggest that she had taken her own life. It is a particularly cruel form of deception, one that not only conceals a crime, but reframes the victim's final act as a choice she never made, adding a layer of confusion and false narrative that her loved ones would have to live with for years before the truth emerged. At the center of that deception, prosecutors would later argue, was a woman Smith had trusted like family. Patricia Hanua Wong, then in her early 60s, had cultivated a close maternal relationship with the much younger Smith, a bond close enough that Smith affectionately referred to her as Hanai Auntie, using the Hawaiian term for an unofficial chosen family relationship that carries deep cultural significance across the islands. That closeness, however, extended into Smith's finances. Following the earlier death of her father, whose passing left Smith with a meaningful inheritance, Wong and Smith established a joint bank account together. As questions began to surface about how funds in that account were being used, and as tension grew between the two women over control of that money, prosecutors say Wong's response escalated far beyond a financial dispute. According to testimony that would not surface publicly for well over a decade, Wong approached at least 2 separate men in the period surrounding Smith's death, offering each of them money to kill her. One was Frank Costa, Smith's former boyfriend. The other was Peter Fuerte, a man Wong had known since childhood. Both men would eventually testify, independently of one another, that Wong made remarkably similar offers to each of them within the same general window of time. A detail prosecutors would later describe as one of the most compelling pieces of circumstantial evidence in the entire case, precisely because neither man had any prior connection to the other, or any obvious reason to coordinate their accounts. Fuerte, notably, also admitted to helping Wong obtain a firearm during this period, though investigators determined that particular weapon was not the one ultimately used in Smith's death. After Smith's body was discovered, it was Wong herself who first reported it to police, telling investigators she believed her Hanai niece had taken her own life. For years, that account was not seriously challenged. It would take 7 full years, until 2016, before a Hilo grand jury returned an indictment against Wong on a single charge of second-degree murder. By that point, Wong had relocated across the Pacific to Nevada, effectively starting a new life a continent away from the investigation, still slowly unfolding on the Big Island. She was eventually located in Las Vegas, taken into custody by U.S. Marshals, and extradited back to Hawaii to face the charge. Even then, the case was far from finished developing. In December of 2022, 13 years after Smith's death, prosecutors returned to a grand jury with a significantly expanded set of charges, formally naming Peter Fuerte as an alleged co-conspirator and accomplice, and adding counts against Wong for attempted second-degree murder, criminal conspiracy to commit murder, and 2 separate counts of criminal solicitation, reflecting the 2 men she had allegedly approached. The trial finally opened in Hilo Circuit Court in November of 2023, more than 14 years after the crime itself. Deputy Prosecutor Matt Woodward laid out for the jury a case built substantially on motive and pattern, a woman who had systematically positioned herself to benefit financially from a young woman's trust, and who turned to violence when that access came under threat. Fuerte, who by that point had already agreed to a cooperation deal with prosecutors, took the stand and described in detail how Wong had approached him about killing Smith. His account aligned closely with Costa's, and prosecutors leaned heavily on the fact that 2 men with no relationship to one another had independently described the same core proposal from the same woman. On the 30th of November, 2023, a jury of 8 men and 4 women returned their verdict. Guilty on every count: second-degree murder, attempted second-degree murder, criminal conspiracy to commit murder, 2 counts of criminal solicitation, Wong, who had remained free on $250,000 bail throughout the trial, watched as prosecutors immediately requested she be remanded into custody. The court agreed, raising her bail to $5 million and taking her into custody on the spot. Sentencing followed a few months later, on the 27th of February, 2024. During the hearing, Smith's mother, Emma Chong, spoke directly to the court on behalf of the daughter she had lost, describing a young woman who had loved life and loved the people around her, testimony that, according to those present, left much of the courtroom visibly moved. Hilo Circuit Judge Henry Nakamoto handed down his ruling without hesitation. Wong received a life sentence with the possibility of parole for the murder conviction, along with a concurrent life sentence for the attempted murder conviction, meaning those two terms would run alongside one another rather than adding additional time. The three remaining charges, conspiracy and the 2 counts of solicitation, each carried a 20-year term, also ordered to run concurrently with each other. Critically, however, Judge Nakamoto ordered that full 20-year block to begin only after the life sentence was served, extending Wong's total time behind bars well beyond what a single life term alone would have required, and ensuring that even if she were eventually granted parole on the murder conviction, additional time would remain. Peter Fuerte's role in the case concluded separately. Under the terms of his cooperation agreement, he pleaded guilty to first-degree hindering prosecution and was sentenced to 5 years in prison, a sentence handed down independently weeks after Wong's own sentencing, and one that reflected the value prosecutors placed on his testimony in finally securing accountability in a case that had gone unresolved for so long. For a case that sat cold for the better part of 15 years, hidden behind the false narrative of a suicide that never happened, the conviction offered something K.C. Smith's loved ones had waited a long time to hear spoken aloud in open court, under oath: the truth. If you or someone you know has experienced financial exploitation by a trusted caregiver or family figure, a pattern more common than many realize, particularly among vulnerable young adults who have recently inherited money or property, Adult Protective Services and local victim advocacy organizations in Hawaii can offer confidential guidance and support. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 3, Tamanu Itawala, August 7, 2021, Oahu Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu Sentenced Facility. Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua, Oahu Keomoku Street, sits at the heart of one of Honolulu's busiest commercial corridors, a stretch of ala moana lined with restaurants, karaoke lounges, and late-night establishments that stay lively long after most of the island has gone quiet. It is a place built for nightlife, for celebration, for the ordinary chaos of a Friday night bleeding into a Saturday morning. It is not, under any normal circumstance, a place where a parking lot becomes a crime scene requiring the Honolulu Fire Department's heaviest rescue equipment. But in the early hours of the 7th of August, 2021, that is exactly what it became. Just after midnight, outside the Imua Lounge, an argument broke out between 29-year-old Tamanu Itawala and 19-year-old Nelia Ann Scanlon. The details of what sparked the confrontation were, by most accounts, unremarkable. The kind of heated exchange that happens outside bars in every city, every weekend, usually forgotten by the following afternoon. This one did not stay contained to words. It escalated into a physical fight that spilled out of the bar and into the adjoining commercial parking lot, drawing in more than just the 2 original combatants. What happened next is where this case departs from the thousands of ordinary bar parking lot altercations that occur across the country every year without ever making headlines. According to police accounts, once the physical fight had run its course, Tawala disengaged, walking away from the confrontation and getting into her own vehicle, a large sport utility vehicle parked nearby. For a moment, it may have looked to onlookers like the situation was de-escalating, that the fight was over and everyone would simply go their separate ways. Instead, Tawala put the SUV into drive and accelerated directly toward the group she had just been fighting with. She struck both Scanlon and a second woman, 31 years old, who had also been involved in the altercation. The force of the impact pinned both women beneath the vehicle's chassis, trapping them in a way that made rescue itself a serious technical challenge. Honolulu Fire Department crews arriving on scene had to deploy specialized pneumatic lifting bags, equipment typically reserved for structural collapses or serious traffic collisions, simply to raise the SUV high enough to extract the two women from underneath it. It is a detail that speaks to just how severe the entrapment was and how far this incident had moved beyond the realm of an ordinary street fight. Scanlon was rushed to an emergency trauma center in critical condition. She did not survive her injuries, passing away the following day on the 8th of August. And she left behind a young son, then just 3 years old, whose life would now unfold without his mother. The second victim, though seriously injured, survived the incident and was expected to recover. Tuala did not flee far. Honolulu police officers located and arrested her in an adjoining parking lot on the same street, and she was initially booked on suspicion of attempted murder while investigators awaited the medical examiner's findings on Scanlon's condition. Once it became clear that Scanlon would not survive, prosecutors moved to formally charge Tuala accordingly, and an Oahu grand jury returned an indictment for second-degree murder, a charge that, under Hawaii law, carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison if convicted as charged. Facing that mandatory life exposure, Tuala's defense team entered into negotiations with the Honolulu Department of the Prosecuting Attorney. On the 30th of August, 2022, she reached a plea agreement, admitting guilt to a reduced charge of manslaughter and formally acknowledging that she had recklessly caused Scanlon's death by striking her with the SUV. It was a significant reduction from the mandatory life term she had originally faced, but it was not the end of the accountability process. At her sentencing hearing on the 5th of January 2023, Tuala's defense counsel made the case for probation, arguing for a chance to remain in the community rather than serve time behind bars. Deputy Prosecutor Anna Ishikawa firmly disagreed, urging the court to impose the maximum statutory penalty available for manslaughter under Hawaii law, arguing that anything less would fail to reflect the severity of what had occurred and the danger Tuala's actions had posed to the public. Prosecuting attorney Steve Alm's office was direct in its public statements about the case, framing it as a moment where an ordinary dispute had been escalated through one person's decision into a fatal act, and that Honolulu's streets would be safer with Tuala off them. Oahu Circuit Court Judge Kevin Souza sided with the prosecution. He denied the request for probation outright and sentenced Tuala to the statutory maximum, 20 years in state prison. What makes this case resonate, beyond the shocking mechanics of how it unfolded, is how quickly it moved from an argument that could have ended with nothing more than bruised feelings to a fatality that reshaped multiple families' lives in a matter of seconds. Scanlon's young son grew up losing his mother before he had the chance to form lasting memories of her. The surviving second victim carries her own physical and emotional scars from a night that began, for her too, as an ordinary evening out. And Tuala, now serving 2 decades behind bars, will spend the bulk of what might have been the most productive years of her adult life paying the consequences of a decision made in a matter of seconds, fueled by anger she chose not to walk away from. Cases like this one are unfortunately part of a broader and troubling pattern: the use of a vehicle as an improvised weapon during an altercation, transforming an ordinary conflict into a fatality in an instant. If you find yourself in an escalating confrontation, personal safety experts consistently advise disengaging and putting distance between yourself and a conflict, including physical distance from any vehicle, rather than returning to the scene in any capacity. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 4. Sina Pili, December 22, 2023, Honolulu Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu, Oahu, Sentenced Facility, Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua, Oahu. Some cases are difficult to tell not because the facts are complicated, but because the person at the center of them held a position of trust so significant that the eventual outcome feels almost impossible to reconcile. This is one of those cases. Before any of what follows, Sina Pili was, by every professional measure, someone a community would point to as a protector of children, a school-based behavioral health specialist, an adjunct instructor teaching social work at the college level, and the adoptive mother of 5 children she had welcomed into her home in the town of Lae, on Oahu's windward coast. On paper, she represented exactly the kind of caregiver the child welfare system hopes to place vulnerable children with. Among those 5 children was an 11-year-old girl named Azalia Pili R.U., who had special needs and had been placed in Pili's home only a short time before her death. having come from another family's care just 2 months prior to being formally adopted. In December of 2023, first responders were called to the Pilley family home following a report that Azalea had been injured in a fall in the shower. When emergency medical personnel arrived, they found the 11-year-old completely unresponsive. She was taken to a nearby hospital, where she was later pronounced dead. What should have been, on its face, a devastating but straightforward accident did not hold up under closer examination. A subsequent medical investigation found injuries and physical evidence inconsistent with a simple fall, findings that led the medical examiner's office to eventually classify the death as a homicide resulting from sustained physical abuse rather than an accidental injury. Investigators would later learn that on the day of her death, Azalea had been visibly ill, suffering from a combination of respiratory infections that would have made physical activity extremely difficult for a child her age. Despite that illness, authorities say she was made to engage in strenuous physical exertion outside the home, and that when she was unable to keep up due to her sickness, she was subjected to a prolonged and severe physical punishment that investigators say lasted roughly 30 minutes. The gap between the initial account given to first responders and what investigators ultimately uncovered became a central and painful thread running through the entire case, a reminder of how difficult it can be for outside systems to see past a caregiver's professional credentials and community standing. Even when something has gone seriously wrong behind closed doors, it would take more than a year for the case to move to formal charges. Pilley was arrested in March of 2025, following a comprehensive grand jury review, and was initially indicted on manslaughter, along with related charges of endangering the welfare of a minor and persistent non-support. She remained in custody without bail at the Oahu Community Correctional Center as the case proceeded, her attorney unsuccessfully petitioning the court on multiple occasions for her release pending trial. In April of 2026, prosecutors made the decision to offer Pilley a plea agreement, a decision they later explained publicly was made, at least in part, to spare Azalea's surviving siblings from having to testify in a full public trial. Under the terms of that agreement, Pilley pleaded guilty to a downgraded charge of first-degree assault, along with misdemeanor counts of endangering the welfare of a minor and persistent non-support, rather than facing the original manslaughter charge that could have carried up to 20 years. Her sentencing hearing took place on the 29th of July, 2026 in Honolulu Circuit Court. Presiding Judge Rowena Somerville, the same judge who, years earlier, had presided over the Boynville case, told the courtroom that in all her time on the bench, she had never before had to sentence a mother for causing serious bodily injury, resulting in the death of her own child, a statement that captured just how far outside the ordinary scope of a courtroom this case had fallen. Before sentencing was handed down, Pilley herself addressed the court, breaking down in tears as she apologized to her community, to her family, and directly to Azalea by name, expressing remorse for what had happened. That apology did not change the outcome. Judge Somerville noted that because of the specific terms of the downgraded assault charge Pilley had pleaded to, her sentencing options were legally capped. She could not, under the plea agreement structure, impose anything close to what the original manslaughter charge would have allowed. Working within those constraints, she sentenced Pilley to the maximum term available, 10 years in prison for the first-degree assault charge with an additional year each on the 2 misdemeanor counts, to run at the same time. Pilley received credit for approximately 18 months she had already spent in custody awaiting trial. The emotional aftermath of the sentencing extended beyond the courtroom itself. According to reporting on the hearing, tensions between Azalea's biological family and her adoptive family, already strained throughout the lengthy legal process, boiled over into a physical altercation in the courthouse corridors immediately following sentencing, a stark and painful coda to a case that had already asked an enormous amount of everyone connected to it. In the weeks that followed, Pilley's attorney filed a motion asking the court to reconsider and reduce her sentence, citing arguments for leniency and mercy, a request that, as of this reporting, remains before the court and has not been finally resolved. Because of this, elements of Azalea's case remain legally active, even as we tell this story. This case also raised broader questions within Hawaii's child welfare system about how caregivers with significant professional credentials in behavioral health and social work are vetted, monitored, and, when necessary, investigated, questions state officials have acknowledged are still being actively examined in the wake of Azalea's death, which was included among the fatalities documented in the state's most recent child fatality report. If you suspect a child in your life may be experiencing abuse or neglect in any setting, please know that reporting a concern is not an accusation. It is a request for someone qualified to check. The Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock, and in Hawaii, the state's Child Welfare Services intake line can be reached at any time to report concerns confidentially. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 5. Leilani Parent, also known as Leilani Alkane. April 20, 2023. Kona District Court, 3rd Circuit Court, County of Hawaii, Hawaii Island Current Facility. Held pretrial within Hawaii's correctional system. Case remains pending. Before we go further into this case, it's important to say clearly, unlike the others in this documentary, this case has not yet gone to trial. Under the law, Leilani Parent is presumed innocent unless and until a jury finds otherwise. What follows is drawn entirely from police statements, court filings and public reporting describing the allegations against her, not a final legal determination of guilt. Kailua Kona sits on the sun-drenched western coast of Hawaii Island, a town built around fishing charters, coffee farms in the uplands above town, and a laid-back pace that draws both retirees and adventure tourists. It is not, typically, a place associated with gunfire exchanged with police officers or cross-island manhunts involving a SWAT team. But in the early morning hours of the 20th of April, 2023, that is precisely what unfolded across a stretch of the Big Island's Kona coast. By that point, Leilani Parent, who also goes by her married name, Leilani Alkane, already had a lengthy history with Hawaii's court system, according to public records stretching back more than a decade, including prior cases involving felony credit card fraud, identity theft, and probation violations. None of that history, however, prepared the Kona community for what allegedly took place that April morning. According to Hawaii Police Department accounts, the trouble began 2 days earlier, on the 18th of April, when officers responded to 2 separate burglaries in the Kailua Kona area. In the course of investigating those break-ins, 27-year-old Dylan Alkane, Parent's husband, was identified as a possible suspect. When officers attempted to make contact and arrest him, police say he fled the scene, driving away in a distinctive dark-colored BMW sedan with a defective headlight, a detail that would later help investigators track the vehicle's movements. 2 days later, in the very early hours of April 20th, officers responding to a break-in at a business on Kanalani Street in Kailua Kona reviewed surveillance footage that allegedly showed a grey BMW sedan, matching the vehicle from 2 days prior, pulling into the area, with the female driver later identified as 35-year-old Leilani Parent behind the wheel. The footage reportedly showed Dylan Alkane getting into the passenger seat before the vehicle left the scene. Roughly 2.5 hours later, at around 4 in the morning, a Kona patrol officer attempted to stop the same BMW near Mamalaho Highway and Rabbit Hill Road in the community of Captain Cook, in connection with a second break-in that had just been reported at a business establishment in the area. According to police, the driver refused to stop, triggering a pursuit through the streets of Captain Cook. It was during that chase, police allege, that gunfire erupted from inside the fleeing vehicle, shots fired from a rifle directly at 3 responding patrol officers. 2 of the officers' vehicles were struck by gunfire, including one whose windshield was shattered by a bullet that police say came within inches of striking the officer inside. Remarkably, none of the 3 officers were injured, though the department's chief later described how close the situation had come to a very different outcome. The chase itself was eventually called off by responding supervisors for safety reasons, but the pursuit was far from over. Police allege that after abandoning the now disabled BMW, Alkane and Parent proceeded on foot to a residential area in nearby Kalakakua, where they carried out an armed carjacking, taking a red 2017 Ford Explorer from a resident at gunpoint in order to continue evading the growing police response. That stolen SUV was last spotted heading toward the upland areas above Captain Cook before it, too, disappeared from view. What followed was a massive island-wide search effort. Hawaii Police Department's Special Response Team, the department's tactical unit, was activated, and officers combed the Captain Cook area and beyond throughout the morning, warning residents to exercise extreme caution and avoid approaching either suspect if spotted. By late morning, the search had led investigators clear across to the opposite side of the island's interior, to a residential property on 2nd Street in the rural community of Volcano, a considerable distance from where the pursuit had originally begun. There, SWAT officers surrounded the home after locating the stolen Ford Explorer parked outside. According to the department's account, both Alkane and parent came out of the residence and surrendered without further incident, bringing the hours-long ordeal to a peaceful close. Both were arrested and initially booked on suspicion of attempted first-degree murder and armed robbery, with additional charges anticipated as the investigation continued. 4 days later, on April 24th, the couple appeared together in Kona District Court and entered pleas of not guilty to the mounting list of felony counts against them. The charges the two defendants ultimately faced diverged based on their alleged roles. Dylan Alkane, accused of being the one who fired the rifle at officers, was charged directly with first-degree attempted murder, along with armed robbery, multiple burglary counts, and a series of firearms-related offences. Parent, alleged to have been driving the vehicle throughout the pursuit and shooting, was charged as a principal accomplice, facing counts including first-degree robbery, unauthorized control of a propelled vehicle, carrying a loaded firearm on a public highway, using a firearm in the commission of a separate felony, and resisting an order to stop a vehicle. Given the seriousness of the allegations and parents' documented history with the court system, bail was initially set at $145,000, later increased during subsequent circuit court proceedings to $700,000, reflecting the court's assessment of both the severity of the charges and a heightened flight risk. In February of 2024, 10 months after his arrest, Dylan Alkane resolved his portion of the case through a negotiated plea agreement, pleading guilty to first-degree robbery for the carjacking, 2 counts of second-degree burglary for the Kona area break-ins, and additional counts of terroristic threatening related to the officers involved in the pursuit. He was sentenced on the 3rd of May, 2024, in Kona Circuit Court, to 20 years in prison. Leilani Alkane's case, however, has followed a different and considerably longer path. As of this reporting, she remains in custody on $700,000 bail, with her trial having been delayed multiple times since her husband's case concluded. Her legal proceedings remain ongoing, and no verdict has yet been reached in her case. This is in many respects a story still being written, one where the community, the officers who narrowly avoided serious injury that morning, and parent herself are all waiting for a Hawaii Island jury to eventually determine what actually happened on that grey BMW's early morning route through Captain Cook. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6, Dixie Denise Villa, February 23, 2019. Oahu Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu Sentence Facility, Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua. Oahu military families move often, and when they do, one of the first and most urgent needs they face in a new posting is reliable childcare. On Oahu's Aliamanu Military Reservation, a residential community housing Army families near Honolulu, that need led one mother to make an arrangement that would ultimately cost her infant daughter's life. Dixie Denise Villa, then in her early 40s and married to an active duty service member, was running an informal childcare operation out of her home on the reservation. It was not licensed, and according to later reporting, neighbors had raised concerns about the arrangement with base housing authorities on multiple prior occasions. Among the children regularly left in Villa's care was 7-month-old Abigail Lobish, whose father served in the Army National Guard. On the evening of February 23, 2019, Abigail's mother dropped the infant and her toddler brother off at Villa's home for what was intended to be routine overnight care, the kind of arrangement countless working military families rely on. Villa was, according to later trial testimony, also caring for her own 2 children that night, after 2 of her older daughters and a visiting family friend had left the home earlier in the day. That left her alone with 4 young children to manage through the overnight hours. The following day, emergency services were called to Villa's home after Abigail was found unresponsive. First responders attempted life-saving measures, but the infant could not be revived and was pronounced dead. In the immediate aftermath, there were no obvious external injuries to explain what had happened, a detail that sent investigators toward a far more detailed forensic examination than a straightforward physical trauma case might have required. That examination ultimately centered on toxicology. A forensic analysis of Abigail's blood revealed a level of diphenhydramine, the active antihistamine ingredient found in over-the-counter allergy and cold medications such as Benadryl, at 2,400 nanograms per milliliter. Medical experts who later testified at trial explained that this concentration was roughly double the level that has been documented as fatal in other infant cases, and that the medication should never be administered to a child under 6 years old without a direct order from a licensed pediatrician, given how differently infants metabolize the drug compared to older children or adults. Investigators concluded that Vila had given Abigail an unprescribed and dangerously excessive dose of the medication, a practice sometimes referred to within child welfare and law enforcement circles as using medication for unauthorized chemical restraint, essentially sedating a child to make them easier to manage. Whether that was Vila's specific intent became a central question at trial, but the toxicology findings themselves were not seriously disputed. Vila was indicted by an Oahu grand jury on a charge of manslaughter in July of 2019 and turned herself in to Honolulu Police Department headquarters, where her bail was set at $1 million. What followed was an extraordinarily long road to trial, postponed according to court records, at least 13 separate times over more than 5 years, a delay that left Abigail's family in a painful holding pattern for the better part of a decade. When the case finally reached trial in November of 2024, Vila's defense attorney argued that the medication's presence in Abigail's system was the result of a tragic miscalculation rather than an intentional act of harm, pointing to Vila's previously clean record and her role as a mother to her own young children. Prosecutors countered that regardless of intent, Vila's decision to operate an unmonitored, unlicensed childcare arrangement while administering an unauthorized sedating medication to an infant in her care reflected a profound and reckless disregard for the children's safety, and that her failure to properly monitor Abigail afterward, as the medication affected the infant's system, was itself a fatal lapse in the most basic duty of care. Jurors, 7 women and 5 men, deliberated for a little over a day before returning their verdict on the 15th of November, 2024, guilty of manslaughter. Vila, who had remained free on bail throughout the lengthy pre-trial period, showed no visible emotion as the verdict was read. Her bail was immediately raised to $500,000, and she was taken into custody on the spot. Her sentencing hearing took place on the 7th of May, 2025. Abigail's mother, Anna Lobish, addressed the court directly, describing more than 6 years, over 2,260 days, as she put it, of grief that had never eased, and a loss she said she would carry every day for the rest of her life until she and her daughter were, in her words, finally reunited. Oahu Circuit Judge Fauga Tuoto'o denied the defense's request for a probationary sentence that would have allowed Vila to remain home with her own 2 minor children, stating that the facts of the case, the witness testimony, and particularly the medical evidence did not support anything less than the maximum available penalty. He sentenced Vila to 20 years in state prison, the statutory maximum for manslaughter under Hawaii law. This case also drew attention to a broader and often under-discussed danger: the improper use of common, easily accessible over-the-counter medications around infants and very young children. Pediatric health experts consistently emphasize that medications like diphenhydramine, while safe when used appropriately in older children and adults, can be extremely dangerous for infants, whose smaller bodies and developing organ systems process these substances very differently. If you are a parent, caregiver, or childcare provider, it's worth reviewing dosing guidance directly with a pediatrician before giving any medication, including common over-the-counter products, to an infant or toddler. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Delilah Williams, July 16, 2005, United States District Court, District of Hawaii Sentence Facility, Federal Bureau of Prisons Facility, specific location not publicly disclosed in court records. Before we begin this case, a note: what follows involves the sustained mistreatment of a young child. We have chosen deliberately to describe what happened in terms of its pattern and its consequences rather than dwelling on graphic specifics, because the facts of this case do not need embellishment to convey their weight, and because how we tell a story about a child matters as much as the story itself. Wheeler Army Airfield sits in the central plains of Oahu, a working military installation surrounded by pineapple fields and the kind of tight insular community that exists on almost every US base. Families who move every few years, children who grow up on post, and a level of everyday oversight that most people assume would catch a problem before it became a tragedy. In this case, it did not, and the consequences of that failure would eventually make legal history in the state of Hawaii. Talia Williams was 5 years old. She lived with her father, Naeem Williams, an active-duty U.S. Army soldier, and her stepmother, Delilah Williams, in family housing on the base, beginning in December of 2004 and continuing for approximately 7 months. Both adults in that household subjected Talia to a sustained pattern of physical abuse and severe neglect, mistreatment that escalated steadily over that period, according to evidence later presented at trial, and that court records describe as including withholding of food and water, physical restraint, and repeated physical assaults, much of it connected to the child's ongoing struggles with incontinence, a medical and developmental issue rather than a behavioral one. To conceal what was happening, Delilah Williams kept Talia largely isolated within the home during this period, away from neighbors, from other children on base, and from the kind of casual, everyday contact that might have allowed someone outside the household to notice something was wrong. It is a pattern child welfare experts describe often in cases of sustained abuse, isolation as both a tool of control and a mechanism of concealment, working in tandem to keep a child's suffering hidden from the very community that might otherwise intervene. On the 16th of July, 2005, the abuse culminated in a final fatal injury. Talia died as a result. In the aftermath, rather than immediately seeking emergency medical assistance, the couple took steps to delay notifying authorities and to alter the scene, actions that would later form the basis of separate obstruction charges against Naeem Williams. Because the abuse and death occurred entirely within the boundaries of a federal military installation, the state of Hawaii had no criminal jurisdiction over the case. It fell instead to federal prosecutors with the U.S. Department of Justice, who took the highly unusual step of pursuing the federal death penalty against Naeem Williams, a decision that made this the first capital murder trial in Hawaii's history since statehood, since Hawaii itself had abolished the death penalty at the state level decades earlier. The case would only be tried as a potential capital matter because it fell under federal jurisdiction on a military base. Delilah Williams's path through the legal system took a different route. In exchange for her cooperation, including a guilty plea and a commitment to testify against her husband, federal prosecutors offered her a binding plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to murder by torture under federal law and agreed to take the stand as the prosecution's central witness, providing detailed testimony about the day-to-day reality inside that household during the months leading up to Talia's death. Her testimony would prove pivotal, giving jurors an inside account of the abuse that no other witness could have provided, precisely because so much of what happened had been deliberately hidden from outside view. Naeem Williams's trial began in April of 2014, nearly 9 years after Talia's death, a gap explained in large part by the extraordinary legal complexity of a rare federal capital case. On the 24th of April, a federal jury found him guilty on both capital murder counts, along with related charges of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and making false statements to Army investigators. The same jury then moved to a separate penalty phase to determine whether Williams should receive a death sentence. On the 27th of June 2014, that jury reported it was unable to reach the unanimous decision required under federal law to impose capital punishment. Under federal sentencing rules, that deadlock meant the court was required to impose a sentence of life in prison instead. Naeem Williams was formally sentenced in February of 2015 to life, without the possibility of parole. The presiding judge, U.S. District Judge J. Michael Seabright, described the household Talia had lived in using a phrase that would later be widely quoted, a house of horrors. Delilah Williams's own sentencing followed under the terms of her earlier plea agreement. In exchange for her guilty plea and testimony that jurors in her husband's case later said had directly shaped their understanding of what happened inside that home, with some jurors saying they held her partly responsible for what had occurred, she received a 20-year federal prison sentence with credit applied for time already served since her initial guilty plea years earlier. What makes this case distinct within the broader landscape of Hawaii criminal justice is precisely the jurisdictional quirk that made it possible in the first place. Had Talia Williams lived and died in ordinary civilian housing anywhere else on Oahu, the case would have been prosecuted in Hawaii's state courts, where capital punishment has not existed for well over half a century. Instead, because the family's military housing placed them under federal jurisdiction, this became the only capital murder trial the islands had seen since before statehood, a legal anomaly born out of tragedy, and one that surfaced difficult questions about how military family life, oversight and jurisdiction intersect in ways that can leave vulnerable children falling through gaps between systems. If you are concerned about the safety of a child in a military family, whether due to signs of physical harm, isolation or behavioral changes, installation, family advocacy programs exist specifically to receive and investigate these concerns, and the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day for anyone, on or off base, who needs guidance on how to report what they've observed. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Henrietta Stone, June 28, 2016. Hilo Circuit Court, County of Hawaii, Hawaii Island Sentenced Facility, no active prison sentence. 10 years supervised probation, with credit for prior custody served at Hawaii Community Correctional Center. Some cases take years to prosecute because the evidence is difficult to gather. This one took years for an entirely different reason, because the person accused of causing a child's death spent much of that time in a prolonged legal limbo over whether she was mentally competent to understand the proceedings against her at all. Shaylin Lehano Stone was 9 years old, developmentally disabled, and had spent much of her early life under the watch of Hawaii's Child Welfare Services system, moving through foster care placements before her maternal grandmother Henrietta Stone was ultimately awarded legal custody and guardianship. The family lived together in an apartment on Kinul Street in Hilo on the Big Island, a residential building that, in one of the more haunting details of this case, sat almost directly across the street from Hilo's Central Fire Station. In October of 2015, Henrietta Stone formally withdrew Shaylin from Hilo Union Elementary School, filing a 1-page application to begin homeschooling the child at home instead. On its face, this was an ordinary administrative decision that thousands of families make every year for entirely legitimate reasons. In this case, however, it had the effect, whether intentional or not, of removing Shaylin from regular contact with teachers, school counselors, and other mandatory reporters who might otherwise have had the opportunity to notice signs that something in the home was seriously wrong. On the 28th of June, 2016, a call to 911 brought first responders to Henrietta Stone's apartment. What they found there, a 9-year-old girl unconscious and severely malnourished, weighing only 45 pounds, led to an immediate transport to Hilo Medical Center, where she was pronounced dead a short time later. A forensic autopsy determined that Shaylin had died from the combined effects of severe prolonged malnutrition, along with untreated pneumonia and a serious kidney infection, conditions consistent with a body that had gone without adequate nourishment and medical care for an extended period. As investigators searched the apartment, they made a discovery that would become one of the most widely discussed details of the entire case. Alarms had been installed on the refrigerator and pantry doors, specifically engineered to alert the household if someone attempted to access food during the night. It is a detail that speaks less to any single moment of violence and more to a sustained, deliberate system of deprivation that had been built into the very architecture of the home Shaylin lived in. 3 people were ultimately charged in connection with Shaylin's death: Henrietta Stone, her legal guardian, and Shaylin's biological parents, Kevin Lehano and Tiffany Stone, who also lived in the household. All 3 were initially indicted on second-degree murder, a charge carrying a mandatory life sentence under Hawaii law if convicted as charged. Tiffany Stone's case resolved first. In December of 2020, she pleaded no contest to a reduced charge of manslaughter, and in March of 2021, Hilo Circuit Judge Henry Nakamoto sentenced her to 10 years of probation, with no additional prison time, a sentence that accounted for the more than 4 years she had already spent in pre-trial custody, unable to make the $100,000 bail set in the case. Kevin Lehano's case followed a similar path. He pleaded no contest to manslaughter in April of 2021 and was sentenced that June also to 10 years of probation, likewise accounting for years already spent in custody awaiting trial. Henrietta Stone's case, however, took a markedly different and far longer course. Rather than proceeding toward trial, her defense repeatedly raised serious questions about her mental competency to understand the legal proceedings against her. questions that led to multiple, extended commitments for psychiatric evaluation over a period stretching across several years. It would take until early 2024, nearly 8 years after Shaylin's death, before Stone was formally deemed competent to proceed and reached her own plea agreement with prosecutors, pleading no contest to manslaughter in February of that year, following the same path her daughter and son-in-law had taken years earlier. Her sentencing hearing took place on the 13th of February, 2025, in Hilo Circuit Court. Prosecutors, working from a presentence investigation report, argued forcefully for the maximum available prison penalty, submitting letters from Shaylin's former teachers and from emergency personnel who had responded to the scene in support of that request. Judge Henry Nakamoto, the same judge who had presided over both of the earlier sentencings in this case, ultimately declined to impose additional prison time, citing Stone's documented psychiatric limitations, her advanced age, and her lack of any prior criminal record. He sentenced her to 10 years of probation, mirroring the outcomes for her daughter and son-in-law, and ordered that she receive full credit for the roughly 7 years she had already spent in custody at Hawaii Community Correctional Center while her competency was evaluated and re-evaluated, time that the court determined had already satisfied any custodial component her sentence would otherwise have required. The disparity between the severity of what happened to Shaylin Lehano Stone and the ultimate absence of any additional prison time for any of the 3 people responsible drew significant public criticism across the Big Island community, with many expressing frustration that a mandatory life sentence had, through a combination of plea negotiations and years of competency proceedings, ultimately resulted in probation for all 3 defendants. This case also highlighted a difficult reality within child welfare systems nationally. A child can be known to protective services from birth, move through multiple placements, and still ultimately end up in a home where the very oversight meant to protect them, regular school attendance, mandatory reporters, routine wellness checks, can be legally and quietly removed. If you know a family that has recently withdrawn a child from school for homeschooling under circumstances that concern you, Hawaii's Child Welfare Services intake line remains available to receive and evaluate any report at any time confidentially. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed, so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Irene Guzman, also known as Irene Castro Guzman, July 9, 2022. First Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu, Oahu Sentenced Facility. No active prison sentence. 10 years supervised probation, with credit for time served at Women's Community Correctional Center, Waipahu sits in Oahu's Central Plain, a former plantation town that has grown into a dense residential community of single-family homes and quiet cul-de-sacs, the kind of neighborhood where a Saturday morning is supposed to mean sleeping in, not waking up to screaming. On the 9th of July, 2022, that ordinary Saturday morning was shattered on Kahualei Place in a case that would eventually become one of the more closely watched domestic violence prosecutions on Oahu that year, precisely because it inverted the pattern most people expect. 31-year-old Irene Guzman, also identified in court documents as Irene Castro Guzman, had spent roughly 2 years in a relationship with a man who lived in the Waipahu home at the center of this case. According to court records, that relationship had ended just 3 days before the incident, when her ex-boyfriend told her he was ending things. There was, notably, no documented history of violence between the 2 of them prior to that morning, a detail that would later surprise investigators and complicate easy narratives about escalating red flags that might have been missed. At approximately 7:30 in the morning, Guzman traveled to her ex-boyfriend's home. According to court documents, she entered the residence and made her way to the master bedroom, where she found her ex-boyfriend asleep alongside a new partner, a 25-year-old woman he had begun seeing in the short time since the breakup. What Guzman did next moved the encounter from a painful personal moment into a criminal one. She went to the home's kitchen, retrieved a large knife, and returned to the bedroom, where she attacked her ex-boyfriend first, causing lacerations to his head and arm as he attempted to shield himself from the blows. When his new partner woke and tried to intervene to stop the attack, Guzman turned the knife on her as well, stabbing her multiple times. A neighbor, awakened by the commotion, looked outside and saw Guzman standing on the home's porch, covered in blood and still holding the knife. Guzman then left the scene in a grey minivan. Both victims, the man and his new partner, were found by responding Honolulu Police Department officers and paramedics suffering from serious stab wounds and were rushed to a trauma hospital. Both were expected to survive. Officers located and arrested Guzman a short time later near the intersection of Moanalua Road and Kahumanu Street in nearby Pearl City. Given the severity of the injuries and the nature of the attack, a Honolulu grand jury indicted Guzman on the most serious charges available: 1 count of first-degree attempted murder and 2 counts of second-degree attempted murder, charges that under Hawaii law carry the possibility of a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole if a defendant is convicted as charged. Her bail was set at $750,000, and she initially pleaded not guilty at her first court appearance. The case drew particular attention from domestic violence advocates and observers of Hawaii's court system, in part because it represented an unusual instance of severe physical violence originating from a female perpetrator against a male victim and his new partner, a dynamic that runs counter to the pattern typically highlighted in domestic violence discourse, and one that advocates noted deserved the same serious legal treatment regardless of which party had initiated the violence. It's also worth noting that Guzman had no prior criminal record of any kind before this incident, a detail her defense would lean on heavily in the months that followed. Facing the very real possibility of spending the rest of her life in prison, Guzman's defense team negotiated with Honolulu prosecutors. In December of 2022, she agreed to a plea deal, admitting guilt to 2 counts of attempted manslaughter, a substantial reduction from the original attempted murder charges, and critically, one that removed the mandatory life sentence from the table entirely. At her sentencing hearing on the 5th of April, 2023, the presiding judge in First Circuit Court weighed several mitigating factors: Guzman's complete lack of any prior criminal history, the genuine remorse she expressed to the court, and what the judge assessed as a real potential for rehabilitation through structured mental health counseling. Although Hawaii law allows for up to 20 years in prison on an attempted manslaughter conviction, the court ultimately granted Guzman 10 years of intensive supervised probation instead of active incarceration, with credit applied for the roughly 8 months she had already spent in custody at the Women's Community Correctional Center while the case was pending. Addressing the court, Guzman expressed a wish that both of her victims could move forward without fear of her. This case illustrates something worth sitting with: the legal system's response to sudden extreme violence born out of romantic betrayal and heartbreak, even in the complete absence of any prior pattern of abuse or warning signs. It is a difficult case precisely because it resists the easy narratives true crime storytelling often reaches for. There was no long history of red flags here, no pattern investigators could point to and say this was inevitable. There was simply a devastating sudden collapse in judgment during an intensely painful moment, with consequences that will follow everyone involved for years to come. If you're navigating intense emotions following a breakup, anger, grief, jealousy that feels overwhelming, reaching out to a mental health professional or a crisis support line before those feelings turn into action is always available and never a sign of weakness. The National Domestic Violence Hotline also offers confidential support to anyone processing the aftermath of a relationship that has become dangerous for any party involved. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Sabrina Lynn Fiai, February 7, 2000, First Circuit Court, City and County of Honolulu, Oahu, with a subsequent unresolved case pending as of this reporting. Sentenced facility: Women's Community Correctional Center, Kailua, Oahu. Most of the cases in this documentary center on a single defining incident: one night, one decision, one irreversible outcome. This final case is different. It spans a quarter of a century, 3 separate stabbing incidents, and a pattern of violence so persistent that it eventually triggered a formal state review of how Hawaii's correctional and parole systems monitor repeat violent offenders. A note before we begin: the most recent chapter of this case remains legally unresolved, with a trial still pending, so we present those details as allegations rather than proven fact. The pattern began in the community of Makakilo on Oahu's leeward side in the early morning hours of February 7, 2000. Sabrina Lynn Fiai, then 36 years old, was involved in a domestic dispute with her husband, Abe Fiai, also 36. While he slept at their home, Fiai armed herself with a steak knife and fatally stabbed him. She was initially arrested on suspicion of second-degree murder, though the city prosecutor at the time notably delayed formal charges, citing Abe Fiai's own documented history of prior domestic abuse convictions and the need to investigate whether a self-defense or battered spouse syndrome claim might be applicable to the case. Ultimately, in her 2001 trial, Fiai reached a plea agreement, pleading guilty to a reduced charge of manslaughter based on extreme mental and emotional disturbance, a legal standard that acknowledges a defendant's significantly impaired emotional state at the time of an offense without excusing the act itself. She was sentenced to the statutory maximum of 20 years in state prison and began serving her sentence at the Women's Community Correctional Center. She was later granted early release on parole by the Hawaii Paroling Authority. It was while out on that active parole, meaning she remained under the state's legal supervision, having served only a portion of her original 20-year sentence, that the second chapter of this pattern occurred. In August of 2005, during an argument in the Kalihi neighborhood of Honolulu, Fiai is reported to have produced a knife and stabbed her then-boyfriend in the hand and abdomen. She was arrested and charged with second-degree attempted murder. It's worth noting that public documentation of this specific incident is comparatively limited, and full court records were not readily available for this account beyond contemporary local news reporting from that period. Court-appointed mental health experts who evaluated Fiai in connection with this second case testified that she was experiencing a severe psychotic disorder, one that had been significantly worsened by long-term methamphetamine use. In August of 2006, she pleaded guilty to attempted manslaughter and received a second 20-year sentence. Because she had committed this new offense while on parole from her first conviction, the state formally revoked that parole, ordering the remainder of her original sentence to run concurrently with her new 20-year term at the Women's Community Correctional Center, meaning both sentences would be served together rather than one after the other. Fiai eventually completed her mandatory minimum terms across both convictions and was released back into the community under continued parole and furlough supervision, a standard part of Hawaii's re-entry process for long-term inmates nearing the end of their custodial obligation. Then, on Tuesday, the 5th of May, 2025, at approximately 12:25 in the morning, Fiai was involved in a third violent incident. Inside the Waikiki Vista building near Kapiolani Boulevard and the Alawai Community Park in Honolulu, an argument broke out between the now 61-year-old Fiai and her 44-year-old boyfriend. According to Honolulu Police Department accounts, Fiai produced a knife and stabbed the man multiple times in the torso, inflicting serious life-threatening injuries. Emergency medical services transported the victim to a trauma center in serious condition. Police located and arrested Fiai at the scene without incident, charging her with attempted second-degree murder, and bail in the case was set at $500,000. This third arrest triggered something beyond the individual case itself. It prompted intense public scrutiny of how a woman with 2 prior stabbing convictions, one of them fatal, had been permitted to move through Hawaii's furlough and parole supervision programs and ultimately return to a position where a third violent incident could occur. State corrections officials indicated a formal administrative review of the case would be conducted, examining what supervision protocols had been in place and whether they had functioned as intended. As of this reporting, Fiai remains held at the Women's Community Correctional Center awaiting trial on the 2025 charge, and no verdict has yet been reached in that case. Given her documented history, she faces the prospect of a significant sentence if convicted, though the outcome remains legally undetermined. What this case ultimately illustrates, more than any single incident within it, is the extraordinarily difficult balance that parole boards, corrections officials, and mental health systems must strike when managing offenders whose violence appears to be connected to underlying psychiatric conditions and substance use, conditions that, when properly treated, can genuinely support successful reintegration, but which, when supervision or treatment falls short, can also precede exactly the kind of recurring danger this case represents. It is neither a simple story of a system failing outright, nor one of an individual beyond the reach of intervention. It sits uncomfortably somewhere in between, and Hawaii's ongoing administrative review into this case may, in time, offer a clearer answer. If you or someone you know is struggling with substance use alongside untreated mental health symptoms, particularly within the context of a relationship where conflict has turned physical even once, both crisis intervention and substance use treatment resources are available through Hawaii's Department of Health, and the National Domestic Violence Hotline remains available to anyone assessing whether a relationship has become unsafe. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. 10 cases, 10 women, 25 years of Hawaii history compressed into a single sitting, and yet, somehow, none of it feels distant. That's the strange weight of true crime told right. These aren't stories from some far-off place we'll never visit. They happened on the North Shore, where families still rent the same kind of vacation homes every week. They happened in Puna, in Kona, in Waipahu, in Lai, in Hilo, towns most of us can find on a map without much effort, places real people wake up in every single morning, utterly unaware of what once unfolded a few streets away. If there's a single thread running through everything we've covered tonight, it isn't that Hawaii is somehow more dangerous than anywhere else. By nearly every measure, it remains one of the safest states in the country. The thread, instead, is how ordinary the beginning of each of these stories was. A cleaning job, a bar parking lot, a childcare arrangement between 2 families, a grandmother awarded custody of a grandchild the system had already failed once, a caregiver with every professional credential a community could ask for, a breakup, an argument in an apartment building near the beach. None of these are exotic setups. None of them announce themselves as the opening scene of a tragedy, and that, more than anything else, is what makes them worth telling carefully, because the warning signs, when they existed at all, were quiet ones. A joint bank account. An unlicensed daycare that neighbors had already complained about. A child pulled out of school under circumstances no one outside the family fully understood until it was too late. We also want to be honest about something that doesn't always make it into true crime storytelling. Not every story here has an ending yet. Leilani Parent is still waiting for her trial. Sabrina Fiai is still waiting for hers. Saina Pili's sentence is still, as of this recording, under active reconsideration by the court. Justice, in the American legal system, is rarely as tidy or as fast as a 1-hour documentary makes it feel. It moves in years, sometimes in decades, shaped by plea negotiations, competency evaluations, appeals, and the simple grinding reality of overloaded court calendars. When we tell you a case is still open, we mean it, and we'll be watching those dockets right alongside you. What we hope you take away from tonight isn't fear, and it isn't fascination for its own sake. It's something closer to attentiveness, a slightly sharper eye for the quiet warning signs that in hindsight so often turn out to have been visible all along. A child suddenly withdrawn from school. A caregiver's story that doesn't quite match the injuries in front of you. A pattern of violence that a system keeps giving second, third, and fourth chances to correct itself. None of these observations are about judgment. They're about the simple communal responsibility of paying attention to the people around us. Because in almost every case we covered tonight, someone eventually did notice, and that noticing is what ultimately brought each of these stories into a courtroom instead of leaving it buried forever. To the families of Telma Boinville, Casey Smith, Nalia Ann Scanlon, Azalea Pili R.U., Abigail Lobish, Talia Williams and Shaylin Lahano Stone, and to the survivors who lived through the cases that didn't end in a loss of life. We hope this documentary handled your stories with the seriousness and respect they deserve. These aren't entertainment to us. They're records of real people whose lives were reshaped in an instant or over the course of years by decisions someone else made. If anything in tonight's episode touched something closer to home than you expected, whether that's domestic violence, child safety, grief, or the aftermath of sudden violence, please don't carry that alone. The resources we mentioned throughout this episode are there around the clock, staffed by people whose entire job is to help, not to judge. That's it for this episode of Cold Case Hour. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you, genuinely. These episodes take an enormous amount of research to get right, and the fact that you're still here tells us it mattered. If you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Give this video a like if you found it worth your time, and drop a comment telling us which of these 10 cases stuck with you the most. We read every single one. We'll see you in the next case.